The number was 11. That was what Ezra Cobb kept coming back to. Not the cold, not the railroad men who had come with their surveying rods and their easy authority, not the 2 feet of snow already sitting on the bench land above the creek. The number 11. He had scratched it into the flat face of a cottonwood plank with the point of his belt knife, working the digit deep enough that his thumbnail could feel the groove in the dark. 11 degrees of arc. That was how far south he needed to angle the front wall of whatever he was going to build, and he needed to get it right before the ground hardened past the reach of his pickaxe, and the ground was hardening fast. He was 41 years old. He had been free for 18 years and a homesteader for 4, which meant he had spent 4 years learning that freedom without shelter was just a slower kind of dying. His claim, 160 acres of benchland above the Weber River, granted under the Homestead Act in the name of Ezra James Cobb, freedman, late of Shelby County, Tennessee, had been crossed, measured, and ultimately swallowed by the Central Pacific's secondary spur line without so much as a written notice. They had sent a man on a good horse who spoke politely and carried papers that Ezra could read perfectly well, which seemed to surprise the man. The papers said the land was needed. The papers did not say what Ezra needed. He had filed a counterclaim in Ogden. The clerk had taken his dollar and written his name in a ledger without looking up. That was 3 months ago. He had heard nothing. He would hear nothing. That he understood this the same way he understood the 11 degrees, not because someone had told him, but because he had worked the numbers himself. So he moved. Not far. 4 miles east and 2 miles south, onto a piece of ground the railroad had no immediate use for, because it was, yes, by the assessment of every practical man in the county, useless. The south face of a long sandstone ridge, steep and exposed, the soil thin over a substrate of red rock. No timber to speak of. No creek within a quarter mile. The nearest settlement, a collection of Mormon farming households called Millburn Crossing, sat in the valley below, and the men there had watched him move his wagon up the rutted track with the particular stillness of people who have decided not to involve themselves. What they saw was a black man, alone, with a single mule named Cora, a wagon carrying 2 trunks, a cast-iron pot, a pickaxe, a long-handled spade, a small bundle of surveying instruments that had belonged to a man he had worked beside on a railroad crew in Nevada, and no visible plan. What he actually had was a plan so precise it frightened him a little when he looked at it. Not because he doubted it, because he had no margin for error and nobody to help him if the numbers were wrong. The surveying instruments had belonged to a Chinese engineer named Lum Wei, who had died of a burst appendix outside of Elko in 1877. Ezra had sat with him through the last night, fetching water, keeping the fire. In the morning, Lum Wei's crew boss had told Ezra he could take what he wanted from the dead man's kit. And he took the instruments and the small cloth notebook in which Lum Wei had recorded his own observations. Not railroad surveys, but something else. Calculations about sun angles, seasonal arc measurements, diagrams of structures that looked nothing like anything Ezra had seen built on the frontier. They were low, thick-walled, half-buried things, with south-facing openings and roofs made of earth. Beside each diagram, Lum Wei had written columns of temperature figures in a script Ezra could not read, but the numbers needed no translation. He had spent 6 years working out what those diagrams meant. He had read everything he could find about adobe construction, about the way the Pueblo peoples of the South had built their cliff dwellings, about the thermal properties of packed earth and sandstone. He had talked to a Ute elder near Price, who had looked at his rough sketches and said, in English, that was better than most of the railroad men Ezra had worked beside, that his grandfather's grandfather had built the same way, and called it listening to the rock. He had talked to a land surveyor in Salt Lake City who had told him the idea was interesting, but impractical for a man working alone. The surveyor had meant well. Ezra had thanked him and left, and begun calculating how to do it alone. 11 degrees south of true east-west. That was the angle at which the winter sun would strike the front face of his dwelling for the maximum number of hours each day. He had measured it with Lum Way's transit, sighting on the sun at noon and again at 3 in the afternoon, checking against the notebook's latitude tables, and the sandstone ridge behind the building site would block the northwest wind. The slope itself would shed water away from the structure. The red rock substrate, 18 inches below the surface, would act as a floor that no amount of cold could buckle or heave. He drove the first stake at the northeast corner of the footprint on the 3rd of November. The stake was a sharpened length of greasewood, and he drove it with 3 measured blows of his pickaxe. Then he paced off 22 feet and drove the second stake, then 14 feet perpendicular, and the third, then the fourth. He stood inside the rectangle he had made and looked south at the valley. The sky was the color of old pewter. Snow was coming before dark. He began to dig. The digging was not romantic work. It was not even satisfying work. But it was the kind of labor that empties a man of everything except the next movement, the next bite of the pickaxe into the clay-shot soil, the next lift and throw of the spade. The cold made the ground ring like iron in the upper inches and softened to a dense red clay below. His hands, already scarred from 2 decades of hard use, split at the knuckles on the second day. He packed the cracks with tallow from a small tin and kept digging. Cora the mule stood at her picket line 20 yards away, her coat fluffed against the cold, watching him with the patient, unreadable attention that mules have and horses pretend to. On the 4th day, a man came up from the valley. He arrived on foot, which Ezra registered as significant. A man who walks to a confrontation instead of riding is either too poor to own a horse or too uncertain of himself to want the height advantage. This man was both. He was perhaps 30, lean in the way of men who work hard and eat uncertainly, with a red beard trimmed close and hands that told the same story as Ezra's, a working man's hands, cracked and broad across the knuckle. He stopped at the edge of the excavation, which was now knee-deep across its full 22-foot length, and looked down at Ezra and said nothing for a long moment. "Cobb," he finally said. "My name's Harker. Fen Harker. I got a place 2 ridges south. The Mormon families down in the crossing asked me to come up and see what you were building." Ezra set the spade upright in the earth and looked at him. He did not offer his hand yet. But he had learned to read the space between a man's words and his body, and Fen Harker's body said he was not sure what he was supposed to do next. "What did they tell you to find out?" Ezra said. "Whether you knew what you were doing." Harker paused. "Whether you were going to be a problem come spring when the mud runs." Ezra looked at the excavation. He looked at his stakes and the cord he had run between them, perfectly level, checked 3 times with Lum Way's spirit level. He looked at the angle of the winter sun, already dropping fast behind the ridge. "You can tell them I know exactly what I am doing," he said. And then, but because the man had walked 2 miles through 6 inches of snow on someone else's errand, and was standing there with his hat in his hands, with the particular look of a man who has no good place to go back to. "You know how to cut adobe brick?" Harker blinked. "Some." "Then stop standing there," Ezra said, "and get in the hole." Fen Harker had built one structure in his life, a chicken coop in eastern Idaho that had blown flat in the first serious wind. He did not volunteer this information. He climbed down into the excavation, took the spare spade Ezra handed him without ceremony, and began to move earth. They worked in silence for the better part of an hour, the sound between them nothing but the rhythmic bite and scrape of iron on clay, the grunt of effort, the hollow knock of a stone being pried loose and rolled to the spoil pile. At the cold sat on their shoulders like a yoke. Their breath hung in the air and dissolved. Ezra watched the other man work the way a carpenter watches a stranger pick up a tool. Harker gripped the spade too high on the handle, burning his arms instead of his legs. He angled his cuts too shallow, taking thin slices that looked efficient and weren't. Ezra said nothing for another 10 minutes. Then he said, "Choke down on the handle. Drive with your hip, not your shoulder. Cut deep and lever it." Harker adjusted without comment. His output doubled. He was, Ezra noted, a man who could receive instruction without making it about his pride. That was rarer than people understood. By mid-afternoon, they had the excavation to its full intended depth, 30 inches below grade across the entire footprint. Ezra climbed out and stood on the lip, looking south. The winter sun was already at a low angle, and it struck the base of the excavation directly, warming the exposed red clay floor. He crouched and pressed his palm flat against the clay. It held a faint heat, like a stone that had been sitting near a fire. Not much, enough to confirm the calculation. Harker climbed out beside him and looked at the hole. He said, "So you're going down, not up." 3 feet down, Ezra said. 6 feet up from there. The ridge takes the wind. The ground takes the cold. The sun does the rest. Harker looked at the south-facing opening of the excavation, then up at the ridge behind them, then back at the sun. He was working the geometry in his head. Ezra could see the moment it connected, a small shift in the man's expression. Not quite surprise. Something closer to the feeling of a lock giving way. "You measured the sun angle," Harker said. "That's what the stakes are for." Ezra said yes. He did not elaborate. He had learned that elaboration, in his experience, produced one of 2 reactions in white men. Either they decided he was showing off, or they decided the idea must be simpler than it sounded, which amounted to the same problem. Harker produced neither reaction. He just nodded slowly, the way a man nods when he is storing something carefully. They began the adobe work the following morning. Ezra had scouted the clay deposits along the base of the ridge 2 weeks before he drove the first stake. The clay was a dense red material, almost greasy between the fingers, excellent for brick. He mixed it with dry grass he had cut and bundled from the bench above. Working the fiber into the clay with his boots in a shallow pit he had dug for the purpose. The mixing was brutal work, the clay sucking at his feet, the cold stiffening the mixture every time he stopped moving. Cora hauled the mixed material to the forms in a canvas sling rigged to the singletree. Harker learned the form work in an hour, a simple open box of scrap lumber, filled, tamped, turned out, stacked to cure. They made 114 bricks in the first full day. Ezra had calculated he needed 460 to complete the walls. He wrote the figure on the flat face of a ceiling timber he had already set. Not a notebook, not a journal, just numbers carved into wood where he could see them every morning. 114. Day 1. On the 5th day of brickwork, Harker did not come. Ezra worked alone and did not speculate about the reason. He made 70 bricks by himself, which was the honest limit of one man without a second set of hands on the forms. He ate cold cornbread at midday, sitting on the spoil pile, and looked at the valley below. The smoke from the Millburn Crossing farms rose straight up in the dead still air. The cold was absolute and dry, the kind that cracked wood and split stone and did not negotiate. Harker came back on the 6th day before light, arriving at the work site while Ezra was still heating water for coffee over a small fire of greasewood. He had a bruise along his left jaw that was fresh and purple in the early gray. He did not explain it. He picked up his spade and went to the clay pit. Ezra poured a second cup and set it on the spoil pile where Harker could reach it. Neither of them spoke about the bruise for 4 days. When they did, it was Harker who opened it. They were setting the second course of the south wall, the wall that would contain the 2 windows Ezra had salvaged from a collapsed outbuilding near Ogden. Real glass, 6 panes each, a piece of luck he had not planned for and had immediately incorporated into the design. The windows were the key. Without them, the passive solar gain was theory. With them, the winter sun became a participant. Harker set a brick, pressed it level, and said, "My brother's cabin is going to fail." He said it the way a man states a fact he has been carrying too long. Cold comes up through the floor, something fierce. He's got his wife, and they've got no wood money left after the summer. "Where's his claim?" Ezra said. 2 ridges south. Same elevation, south face, and same as this, but he built flat on the ground. No thermal anything, just logs and hope. Ezra set his brick and reached for the next one. How far south facing? Harker thought about it. Straight south. He aimed at noon sun. Ezra was quiet for a moment. Noon sun in November. At this latitude, hits the wall at a low angle and bounces off more than it enters, he said. You want the morning sun? The 9 and 10 o'clock sun. That's the penetrating angle in winter. Straight south is a summer orientation. Your brother built a summer house. Harker stared at him. He didn't say anything for a long time. Then he said, "Nobody told him that." "Nobody told me either," Ezra said. "I worked it out." The walls rose through the 3rd week of November. Ezra set the window frames himself, it calculating the depth of the overhang above each one with the same precision he had applied to everything else. The overhang was critical, deep enough to block the high summer sun that would overheat the interior in July, shallow enough to admit the low winter sun all the way to the back wall. He carved the overhang dimension into the ceiling timber beside the brick count. 16 inches. Checked twice against Lumway's solar tables. The roof was the hardest part. He had no timber for conventional rafters. What he had was a collection of salvaged rail ties he had hauled from an abandoned siding 8 miles east, heavy with creosote and nearly impervious to rot. He set them across the top of the walls at 2-foot intervals, the ends buried 6 inches into the adobe. Over the ties, he laid a double course of smaller adobe bricks. Over that, 18 inches of the excavated earth, tamped firm, seeded with the same dry grass he had used in the brick mix. The roof became the ridge. Seen from the valley below, the structure vanished into the hillside. The only evidence of a dwelling was the 2 salvaged windows catching the afternoon light and the small iron stovepipe rising 18 inches above the roofline. On the 29th of November, Ezra Cobb moved inside. The interior was 14 feet wide, 22 feet long, 6 feet 4 inches of clearance, enough for a tall man to stand without ducking if he stayed near the center. The walls were the raw red adobe, smooth troweled. The floor was the natural clay subgrade, tamped hard and swept clean. The 2 windows on the south wall admitted a band of low winter sunlight that tracked slowly across the floor through the morning hours, striking the north wall and the packed earth around the stovepipe base. There was no conventional fireplace. There was the small cast-iron stove, a Acme sunflower model that Ezra had paid $11 for in Ogden. Its pipe angled not straight up, but running horizontally for 4 feet through a stone-lined channel set just below floor level before rising to exit the roof. The horizontal run forced the hot gases to surrender their heat to the stone channel before escaping. The stone channel warmed the floor directly above it. He lit the stove for the first time that evening, feeding it a double handful of greasewood sticks. He sat in the one chair he owned and watched the stove and waited. After 40 minutes, he took out Lum Wei's thermometer, a glass instrument in a brass case, calibrated in both Fahrenheit and a French scale he had never bothered to decode, and held it at chest height in the center of the room. He read the figure, walked to the ceiling timber, and carved it beside the brick count and the overhang dimension. 54 degrees Fahrenheit. Stove barely warm. Outside temperature, by his morning reading, had been 19 degrees, a 35-degree differential on the first night, with a fire a child could have maintained. He sat back down in the chair and looked at the carved numbers for a long time. Then he put another handful of sticks in the stove, not because he needed to, but because the moment seemed to call for something. Outside, the first serious snow of the season was beginning to fall. Yet the cold that arrived on the 14th of December did not build. It dropped. Overnight, the temperature fell to 22 below zero and stayed there for 11 days without relief. Wells froze to their stones. Livestock died standing. In Millburn Crossing, 3 families burned their furniture by the end of the first week. Fenn came up the ridge on the 4th day, moving fast despite the snow. His brother Cale's cabin floor had gone to ice. His sister-in-law Dessa had a cough that had moved into her chest. They needed somewhere to go, and Fenn had nowhere to bring them except up. Ezra said, "Bring them." They arrived that evening, Cale half carrying Dessa, her face gray and drawn tight with cold. She stopped in the doorway and stood still. The air inside was 58 degrees. Ezra had barely touched the stove in 2 days, yet the thermal mass of the walls and floor doing the work the fire had started. Dessa pressed her bare hand against the adobe wall and made a sound that was not quite a word. They stayed 9 days. Ezra slept against the north wall. The brothers took the floor near the stove. Dessa took the cot Ezra had built from rail tie offcuts. The stove burned a modest cord of greasewood across those 9 days. A comparable log cabin would have burned 4 times that and still lost the fight. On the 5th day, 2 men from the valley rode up. A farmer named Pollard and the informal elder of Millburn Crossing, a broad man called Reuben Stott, who had the careful eyes of someone who had survived by being right about things. They stood in the entrance and looked at the interior. They looked at Dessa sitting up on the cot, with color returning to her face. They looked at the thermometer reading on the ceiling timber. 61 degrees. Outside was 18 below. Stott said, "The ridge is what's doing it. Shelters you from the north wind." Ezra said the ridge helps. The angle of the walls, the mass of the adobe, the window placement, the floor channel, those are doing it. Stott nodded slowly. "Convenient slope," he said, and rode back down. That was the whole of it. No curiosity. No questions about the window overhang, or the floor channel, or the sun angle carved into the timber. The valley went back to its log cabins the following spring. Nobody built adobe. Nobody asked Ezra to explain the numbers on his ceiling beam. He did not offer again. Dessa recovered. Cale and Fenn went back to their claims when the cold broke in late January. Fenn shook Ezra's hand at the door and held it a moment longer than a handshake requires, and said, I won't forget what you worked out here. Ezra said, write it down somewhere. In case. Fenn said he would. Whether he did, nobody recorded. Ezra planted his first crop in April, a half-acre of winter wheat on the bench above the dwelling. The structure behind him held the even temperature of deep earth, unbothered by the spring winds that scoured the ridge. The numbers were still carved in the ceiling timber. 54 degrees, first night. 11 degrees of arc. 460 bricks. 16-inch overhang. A record no one asked to read. A solution that worked completely and was credited to a convenient slope and left there. He was alive. His claim was intact. That was the count that mattered. If Ezra, Fenn, and Dessa's story pulled you in, hit the like button. It tells us to keep these stories coming. Subscribe to Wild West Survival Tales so you never miss the next character fighting to stay alive on the frontier. Drop a comment below. When Stott rode back down that hill without a single question, what do you think that moment said about the kind of survival knowledge that gets buried and forgotten? Because on this channel, the next survivor is already waiting.